So welcome to the St. Louis Angular Lunch for October 2015. I'm Kyle Cordes. I'm at Oasis Digital, which is where you guys are. I apologize for the last minute room change, which cost us about 10 minutes of getting our act together. We had a fantastic logistical plan to start in a timely way, one building away, and we got shifted at the last minute. So I will just go a little bit faster and skip a few steps. I'm going to talk today about Aurelia. I put the word Angular on the screen here so that it would make some sense that I'm talking about it at the Angular lunch. Aurelia is something that is often compared to Angular. Some people consider it a competitor to Angular. I'm not really sure. I don't know that it's any more a competitor than the other 87 frameworks. It maybe looks a little bit more like Angular than, say, React does. But fundamentally, I think they're actually both great things, and I like them both. So this talk will have some comparison, but this is not a versus talk. There won't be any bar graphs of who's better at what. I actually really like both, and I think there's a good chance both will get a pretty good following. Okay, so Durandal was the predecessor to Aurelia. It started in 2012 and had a strong couple of years. It actually gained quite a few users. Rob Eisenberg is the guy who started it, and he's given some really good Aurelia talks at various conferences. So if you're interested in more than the 20 minutes I'm going to talk, use the Google on YouTube, and you'll find him talking about it. But they started this Durandal thing. So this would have been around the time that Angular 1 was starting to get some traction. But it was kind of unproven. This is before the big kink in Angular adoption. At the time, instead of kind of starting from scratch, he actually built Durandal on Knockout is kind of the main tool underneath. So the data binding of Durandal is Knockout. And it's pretty slick. I've used Knockout for some pretty serious work a couple years before that. And Knockout is a great tool. It's really effective. I was actually kind of surprised to see them step away from Durandal. But nonetheless, Rob joined Google for a while. Is it 2014? Can somebody tell me if this number is correct?
That sounds right.
Okay, an answer from the audience, 2014 is the right year. He was there for a while to help on Angular 2. He left to carry some ideas in a different direction. As far as I can tell from the outside, it was an amicable departure. There wasn't any sort of fight about it. Just he had some different ideas than where Angular was going, and those ideas became Aurelia. So it's a successor to Durandal from a person who's been involved with Angular. So I guess that's maybe where some of the versus language you see comes from. I'm going to show you some binding syntax, but I'm going to show you that in code instead of on a slide. Aurelia has maybe a little more focus on common cases and conciseness than Angular. So that's kind of the easiest way to understand it from an Angular point of view. We'll see this in the code. Behind the scenes, Aurelia has this really great focus on web standards. So they really go out of their way to not invent things that duplicate things that are kind of upcoming or proposed or even current standards. And so rather than use a bunch of just sort of random libraries out there to build on, it actually only depends on polyfills. So it has the charming property that, in theory, with each new version of browsers that come out that have more standards implemented in the browser, you would just delete something from what you were going to include to use Aurelia. So it's most things I'm used to just grow inevitably with time, and this will actually shrink with time, theoretically anyway. I'm really curious. But it's also a pretty pragmatic thing to use. There are people out there that are already in production with Aurelia, even though it's not even in beta yet. So I think in terms of just kind of an adoption cycle, it might even be a little bit ahead of Angular. Okay, there's a bunch of commonalities. Oh, look, spelling error. There's a bunch of commonalities between Aurelia and Angular 2. And of course, we look at these a lot because here at Oasis Digital, we do a whole lot of Angular, so we look at Angular 2 a lot. But looking at them in comparison is actually really helpful to understand Angular 2. So when you read about Angular 2 and you see all these examples and these slides and these talks and these opaque things on screens, it's not obvious which things you're looking at are Angular things versus web component things versus ES6 or TypeScript things versus module things. Whereas if you look at a similar framework, then you can really recognize which things about Angular 2 are truly about Angular 2 versus which are just kind of part of the next generation of all the tools. The most obvious difference you'll see looking at code, if you're, say, comparing Angular 2 code, is Angular 2 has a lot of things that are explicit. Aurelia has lots of things that are implicit instead. And I'm going to flip through these slides and show you that in code in a minute. The single biggest difference, and I actually really like this in Aurelia, is that in Angular 2, you declare your template, your inter-template dependencies, your inter-component dependencies, you declare those in the JavaScript file. With Aurelia, you declare them in the template file where you're using them. So that'll be pretty nice. And I'm going to skip this one because I'll show that in the code. And this slide I'll return to at the end. Okay, so hopefully I didn't spend more than, 4 or 5 minutes on slides. It's kind of the limit of my tolerance. Okay, so let's look at an Aurelia application. Oops. So here's a running Aurelia application. Oh. Huh. Got to figure out where to click to make the right thing bigger. So this is not a very complex application. I just have a hello world, and then I have some links to some blog posts that I rendered with some data I got over HTTP. So here we go. We show some data on a screen. We have some links. You click a button, it goes to the link. So this is a pretty simple application. Okay. Let's look at the source code for this application. Okay. So at the top level, I have some unimportant files. Back row, how big is the text? How much bigger does it need to be?
A lot bigger. There you go.
Big enough now? Well, if it's big enough now, then that means it might not be big enough on the video. So now it's big enough. Okay. I have just some sort of files that are involved in the dev setup, so I'm going to skip those. The important thing is, I'm going to try to talk just the minimum about JSPM. But JSPM is a JavaScript package manager that tries to leap to the standards that aren't even out yet. So JSPM is supposed to adapt all the packages we already have in JavaScript with the way package or module loading are going to work in the future in the JavaScript standards or in the web standards. Right? So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of how it works here because I want to keep it brief, but I'm using JSPM to load all the Aurelia stuff I'm using. Okay. So an Aurelia application is an index file like any other. If anybody has looked at Angular 2 yet, you should recognize lines 9 and 10. That's exactly the sort of thing you say in Angular 2 all the time. On line 13, we tell Aurelia to bootstrap itself. And the slick thing about that is that it automatically grabs something called Aurelia app. Anybody know what ng app does in Angular? Somebody shout it out. Interactive class. Somebody tell me.
Bootstraps the Angular application.
There you go. So Aurelia Bootstrapper, you do have to tell it to do it, but it actually is set to, by default, if you don't configure it otherwise, it bootstraps something called Aurelia app. It furthermore automatically bootstraps a component called app. So you can change that, you can put it somewhere else, but by default, the top of your application gets called app, and here is our Aurelia program. Where does it say Aurelia in this program? Can somebody point to it or yell it out? Where does it say Aurelia? Yeah. So now it doesn't even say Aurelia. Aurelia is extremely convention driven. So it is like the knob of convention and configuration is turned all the way to the very end of the convention end on Aurelia. So this is an Aurelia program that does not import or use any Aurelia words. That's pretty slick. This is an ES6 class. It doesn't even have a constructor, but there's this convention in Aurelia where if your application top-level class or component has a method called configure router, it will be called to configure the router. Now, the downside of it being totally configuration-driven is that there's nothing I can press right here. Like, there's no way to get a... this configure router is there only because I've used it on the screen. But if I hadn't used it, I'm not calling something .configure router, so that the IDE help is maybe not quite as good as it could be, but it's pretty nice. That's pretty brief. Okay, so to point out other things in this router, look at, I guess I need to, here we go. So did anybody use Sublime before? To see something like that? Any Sublime users in the room? Okay, see how it says module ID? In Aurelia, your routes point to a module. They don't point to a class, they point to a module. That means that they don't point to anything imported. So if you look right here, module intro, there's nothing at the top to import module intro. That means there's no compile time dependency on module intro. That has some downsides, but the big upside is that, or with Aurelia, you get asynchronous on-demand loading of other code by default. Right? So that's not a feature you have to go find and ask for and set up. You have to configure it, it's just there. And they do that by having routes go to modules. So let's say I wanted to figure out what is this intro thing? Well, this is just ES6, so if I click on intro.js, this is the code for intro. Now this time I included the word Aurelia again. This time it's in a comment, it's not even in a string literal. So an Aurelia component, this is an Aurelia component, or I guess they call it a custom element. That's actually the web standards word. If you're making an Aurelia custom element, you actually don't even need to import Aurelia to do so. And I think that's pretty slick too. So this is the next big part of my Aurelia program that never even mentions Aurelia, doesn't import anything. Now, of course, I skipped over something on app, and I've pointed out here in the intro. It's implied that if you just take this same module and put HTML on the end, that's the template that's going to be used for this code. Now, if you don't like that, there's a way to put annotations. There's all kinds of things. You can overload anything you want, but the default is really almost always the right thing. Okay, so app.js goes with app.html. Intro.js goes with intro.html. Now, there's a couple of others that I'll get to if I have time, but just looking at the simplest cases here. Okay, so lines 1 and 12, that is the upcoming to be standardized web components syntax for a template. And there are bits of that in Angular. I'm going to use that as a reference point. In fact, Paul here and I today, we're just using the template syntax in Angular. But in Angular, your component level templates don't say template. Is that right? Somebody confirm that?
Right.
Right, okay. In Aurelia, kind of matching the web standards, you get these extra words. Now, I'm not sure if that's a great thing or not because it's 2 extra lines in every template file, but it matches the standards. The next 4 lines are an Aurelia-ism because over here, there's nothing in here importing other components that are used inside this component. Only when we get to the HTML do we import the components. And we're going to skip these CSS ones. Those are just sort of a little bit of a convenience method. This is the important one. The main component uses the Nav Bar component. Now it says require from equal Nav Bar. You do a incredibly difficult mapping. That's the name of a module, and so it's navbar.js. Right? So you can, if you're looking at a template, you want to know what else does it uses. It uses the stuff that's in Nav Bar. So it's navbar.js and navbar HTML. And this is really slick because even without looking at the code, just looking at a template, you have somewhere to look in here to find the meaning of new custom things you see, right? So here we have Nav Bar, and so what on earth is a Nav Bar? Well, a Nav Bar, it has to be required up here. So when you're looking at a template, you don't go looking at some other file to figure out the meanings of what you're calling them right in here. And that's another little difference point in Angular 2. I'm kind of hoping Angular 2 picks up some syntactic sugar like this in the next few months, because I think this is really nice. There's a directness to having the thing you're using in the place you're using it. Okay, so the next little bit of difference. To bind something, to bind a property, you put .bind after it, and then say the name of what you want to bind it to. So what would the Angular equivalent to that be? Any idea?
NG model with.
Yeah, something like that. Or there would be like a custom ng router. There'd be something custom, right? With Angular 1, you'd have to make some custom attribute. The slick thing about this is that this could be any attribute with the word bind after it, then you can bind to it. Has anybody here tried Angular 2 yet? Okay, so if you tried Angular 2, in Angular 2, you would do something more like this. So that would be the Angular 2 way of expressing the same idea. I know there are endless arguments about the technical trade-offs of them, and I really have no idea which one will win in the ultimate technical struggle. But I do know that the syntax on line 7 can be used trivially from Jade, and I use Jade a lot, and the syntax on line 8 can't. So I have a bit of a sticking point we're trying to get past on Angular 2 right now, is how to be able to use Jade for our Angular 2 templates. That's not a sticking point with Aurelia, because you just say .bind. And I also think that in terms of learning, it's pretty easy to learn that, right? It's pretty direct. By the way, a .bind means bind either one way or two way. I happen to know this one is really just a one way, so you can use that syntax instead.
Quick question of clarification.
Yeah.
The router in the parent on line 7, that's
Yes.
referring to the router object that lives inside
In the quotes.
the component?
Yeah, so app.js has a thing called router. Just yes, it has a router. So this router is this router.
Okay, and the one on line.
This one is the one inside Nav Bar. We'll step in there next. Now, I should have named them differently. It's a common problem. If I wanted to, I could say this dot like that, right? And then I could go in here, and I could name that one this way,
Okay.
and I could just make sure it works. So let's make sure the whole application still works. Yes, the whole application still works. So, okay, pretty slick thing here. If you want to make it explicit that using a one-way binding, you use this deeply encoded, difficult to understand language, right? It's extremely unlikely that anyone doing code review or anyone even freshly learning could possibly be confused as to whether we're doing one-way binding now. I really like that. It's not quite as tight a syntax as putting just a pair of square brackets around it, but I think in terms of ease of entry, it really wins. Next, this is the template for the app. We're using a router, and so if you're defining a router, you say router view to say where the router is going to insert the thing you routed to. So what's the name for this in Angular 2, Paul?
Like router outlet?
Router outlet, right. So it's there's a lot of naming. Many ideas are very similar, just a little bit of naming. Then what do? It's a ng view in Angular 1 we do. So I really feel like in Aurelia they've spent a lot of attention on naming. They've tried to make names that are exceptionally direct and obvious, very easy to learn, and when there's any kind of a question, they try to stick as close as they can to web standards. So I really like the naming in here. Okay, so we looked at Nav Bar. Let's just see how that works. So here's a Nav Bar. This is the first time I actually had to import something from Aurelia because I wanted to make something bindable. And to make it properly bindable, you use the cleverly named @bindable marker, and that's it. So now I have this class. It has a thing on it called router, starts out null by default, and it's bindable. So that's actually all I had to do. If I want to be able to inject this router here using this, I just had to make a variable and mark it bindable. It should be pretty easy to grab, even for even transitioning from another tool. I can probably remember bindable. Okay, and so that makes this top of the screen part work. And then there's only one piece left in the sample app, which has a couple more ideas to show. So here's the most complex part of the whole application. Actually, it's posts, yeah. So this is for this screen, posts. The template. Okay, so I said anything I used in a template, I need to require it at the top of the template. Later, I'm going to use a thing called JSON format here, so I get a thing called JSON format. By the way, if anybody hasn't done much with, actually raise your hand if you've done anything with ES6 modules yet. Good, okay. When you say / when you're loading an ES6 module, that means in the directory I'm in. And that's pretty nice because right now I'm all in one directory, but if you have a complex application with 20 different directories, you're not restating the full path to everything all the time. You're able to use kind of relative names of things. Okay, so this thing uses something called JSON format. Then all of this is just HTML. This is the binding format for data in Aurelia. I believe they chose this because this is the JavaScript ES6 literal string binding format. If I'm saying that right. Is that the right word? Yeah. So that, once again, they didn't make up their own syntax. They grabbed some syntax that developers are likely to want to use anyway based on some kind of standard, and they shoved that syntax in the middle of HTML. Did anybody ever use nghref in Angular? Somebody tell me why I have to use nghref in Angular.
Because if you don't, your link is exposed with those double curly braces.
Right.
Potentially invalid target.
Right. So with Angular 1, they had to make a custom nghref. For Angular 2, they've added a syntax like this. And in Aurelia, they've chosen this syntax. So you can take any property, put .bind after it. It'll do this. You'll look up the value of this thing and shove it in that. So it's actually very analogous to what Angular 2 offers, except it's a slightly more verbose syntax. Okay. Next.
Probably line 12, the repeat format.
Oh, yeah, he's the most complicated one. I'll get to him last.
Oh.
Okay. Okay. The next thing to talk about is Angular has filters. What's Angular 2 have instead of filters?
Pipes.
Pipes. Angular 2 has pipes. We worked with those here this week. Aurelia has value converters. So which word is better? I don't know which word is better, but they came up with a different word. By coincidence, it's the exact same syntax. But this little bit is nice, right? So if I use a particular value converter here, and I wonder, like, where was that value converter defined, right? Where would I find the code for that value converter? With Angular 1, there's kind of a global registry they would all be in. With Angular 2, you would have to go over to the code and put something in here to make that value converter available, or that pipe available. Aurelia, again, picked just a different approach to the same problem, but in their approach, everything that's used in this template is going to be required at the top of the template. Right? So you never have to look anywhere other than right, in the file, scroll to the top, that's the stuff that's used. The definition, this is pretty straightforward, right? There's not a built-in JSON value converter yet, so I just made one. Well, there's a convention, right? So the convention, there's not configuration, there's no import. So a value converter actually doesn't need to import anything from Aurelia to be a value converter. That's nice. And it just has to implement something called toView, which gets passed a value, then it returns some other value. So by implementing this tiny little value converter, I was able to get the data to appear in JSON. Okay, so then the one I skipped is the most complicated one. I'm unclear exactly where this syntax came from. I don't know how this fits in with the rest of the syntax. I don't know if there's other things you can say repeat dot, or if there's other things you can say, something dot for, or if this repeat for, like if this is a unique thing all on its own. But again, it's very similar to ng repeat. It's very similar to ng4 and Angular 2. Maybe they couldn't decide if the word repeat or for was better, so they just shoved them both in there. But again, I think the nice thing here is that it's unlikely anyone reading this, even if they were not an expert, would have any trouble figuring out what this does. Okay, and it does work because when you look here, there are 4 blog posts. Here we go. Okay, there's only one more bit of complexity here, and that is how those things got loaded. Let's look at that. Okay, I felt it would be a poor practice to put code right in a component, which is kind of like an Angular 2 component, kind of like an Angular 1 controller. Very poor practice to put code in there that does an HTTP request, right? Can I get a nod at least? It's poor practice. So instead, you want to push that off to some, what we call a service in Angular 1. We want it to be somewhere that's not here. So let's put it somewhere. The somewhere I put it was in a unit called blog, a module called blog, and that thing defines a thing called capital blog. And I'm going to guess, let me see here, this inject is what lands here. Okay, so add inject, this is an Aurelia-ism. You can mention the things that should be injected, and those are simply positionally matched to what's in the constructor. And I only have one, so I only have one. So it's going to instantiate an instance. It'll be a singleton, just like an Angular 1 service or factory. And then that'll get injected here, and then we're going to capture it to make it available. But activate is a fun one. Can somebody who doesn't work at Oasis Digital, so there's only a couple of you, tell me what do you do to make sure you have data before you render a page with Angular 1?
Resolve.
Right, so with resolve, you go up to the router and say, before I go to that route, go get this data. We had noticed, and a number of people complaining online had also, that you can end up with a really kind of a fat router configuration that knows a lot about the internals of the things being routed to. So I was interested to see Aurelia kind of turn that upside down. So with Aurelia, when you have the code for a component, if it has a method called activate, that method will be called in the process of activating that component. And if activate returns a promise, it will wait until activate returns before rendering the component, which means that is the equivalent of resolve. So in the component, instead of out in some other configuration, you can say, do this when I load, and as long as you return a promise, you have the resolve behavior.
Angular 2 can activate.
There's a can activate. Now, can activate return a promise, or is this something different?
It has the exact same purpose.
Exact same purpose, right. It would be really fun, and I haven't done this yet, to go look at the history of both and try to figure out which one it appeared in first. Because I get the idea that certainly in the time that Rob Eisenberg was at Google, and probably thereafter, I would guess there's a fair amount of cross-pollination. There's a lot of just plain good ideas floating around, and a lot of the ones that are pretty universal, I think, are ending up in both Aurelia and Angular 2. And the ones where different people had different ideas, those are the differences between the two.
An interesting note is that can activate arrived in Angular 2 via them figuring out how to make a router work, which makes it even more interesting, this question that you're posing
Right.
as to how that.
Right.
And one of the other things with can activate is it's actually called or declared through a decorator. It's not a method like this. So what you inject through the constructor is not available at that point.
So that's, I think, the single biggest pervasive difference between working with Aurelia and working with Angular 2 is in Angular, it's explicitly configured. So you import a bunch of Angular things, you put a bunch of Angular-specific decorations or annotations, which configure what's going to happen. With Aurelia, you import very few Aurelia things. Here, I finally had to import one on this slide, right? And it's just a convention. So instead of a decorator that wires it up, and the downside is you just have to know. The plus side is if you do this 50 times in your application, you have a lot less lines of code to do this. Is that okay?
Another quick observation. With this highly conventions-based approach,
Yes.
I can see why there's such a strong drive right now for TypeScript. I can simply say post implements a whatever this kind of thing is. It has an activate thing, and all of a sudden I got IDE support,
Yeah.
as well as tooling support. Tell me if I implemented this thing correctly.
Yeah.
That's
Now, I should mention TypeScript a little bit. I think I might have a slide where I mentioned it too, but right now Aurelia is written in ES6, maybe with a couple of ES7 features turned on. I'm not sure. And then there are DTS files to make it easy to consume from TypeScript. There is an ongoing thread in an issue on the Aurelia project considering writing Aurelia in TypeScript. Just because so many people have found, including everybody here certainly, that like kind of regardless of whether you like TypeScript, the convenience of having IDE, design time or editing time help is it's a huge convenience. It is just enormously helpful to have your IDE helping you using types. So even if you don't want types and don't use types in your own code, it's actually a lot more fun to consume things that are written in TypeScript. So I'll be curious to see. This wouldn't break. Like they could switch all of Aurelia to TypeScript, and I could still consume it from ES6, which is what I'm doing here, and there would be no harm. But that's kind of an open idea floating out there. Okay, so the only piece I haven't explained is what's in this blog thing. Well, the great thing about this, let's see here, where do I use inject, right? Okay, is that you're going to see that polyfill idea in action here. Okay, this is just some library I grabbed off of NPM first and then later off of GitHub. There's a great story here. I grabbed this because I was just looking for a way to consume some XML and get JSON. I did that because to put the data in here, I just copy-pasted a bunch of CRUD from the RSS feed for our company blog. I just wanted some data to work with. But I didn't want to write code about XML DOM. That didn't feel very 2015 to manipulate XML DOM in JavaScript. So I said, well, just give me something that takes in XML and spits out JSON. So I find this thing, and it so happens that the person who wrote this is using Aurelia in production. And so I think he was astonished when he got is either a pull request or an issue on his repository of some crazy guy he's never heard of saying, hey, I was using your thing with Aurelia recently. But anyway, so this thing exposes itself as an object, right? So notice it doesn't have these guys. So this is the syntax if you want to import something which is kind of traditional JavaScript, not class-based. This is the syntax if I'm like importing a ES6 module that has a bunch of separate exports in it, right? And so it turns out that to use this guy, I just type this syntax and it works. That's kind of JSPM-isms. Maybe in a future talk, I'll dig into JSPM a bunch more. I wanted Lodash, and so I used that same syntax, right? So this is very similar to how you use Lodash, like with require or something, except it's the ES6 syntax. Then lastly, fetch is a polyfill that implements the capital, all capitals fetch standard still in development, which is supposed to replace XML HTTP requests. So XML HTTP request is a very old, not very well standardized API. There's a replacement for that called fetch, which is making its way into the browsers. It'll probably be there in a couple of years. It so happens that the Aurelia way of talking to HTTP is what they call the Aurelia fetch client. So to use the Aurelia fetch client today, you have to put in this fetch polyfill. Right? So it's a lot of words, but the upshot is that I'm using a like 2018 standards-based way of doing an XML HTTP request. And I'm doing that in 3 lines of code. Okay, so I need inject because I'm going to inject something. So again, this is the only like framework level Aurelia thing. And I happen to use the Aurelia way of talking to HTTP just because I was trying to learn Aurelia. And it just took a couple of lines to do so. So look, here I injected the client. I called fetch on it. I did some promise chaining. And this is just an artifact of how the fetch API works. And then, where is that guy? I run him through this mapping to dig out just the information I want. And then, let's see, load. Where does load get called? I think load gets called at the point after the page is loaded. So that activate happened on the way in and load happens after. So this is another Aurelia hook. Okay, so that is it. You've seen all the code for this little sample app. It's not much of a sample app, but I tried to make something just big enough to show a bunch of little interesting Aurelia ideas. So we're a little low on time, but I will take questions and I will flip up the last interesting slide. So, questions?
So on that last thing with load, would you say activate is to load as Angular 2's onActivate is to onInit? About the same?
Yes, I think that's right. And I have no idea how the two groups came up with their names, and I don't know which one came up with their names first. So there might be a bit of a kind of like I guess a land war for names going on, where I grab the obvious name, then you don't want to name the same as me, so you take a less obvious name. So I have no idea what the actually no, this is not an Aureliaism. I finally realized that this is just a JavaScript class. Over here in posts, I called load. Yeah, I got that wrong. Load is there's a different thing, which is like activate, but it happens after. Instead of being something happens before with a promise, it happens after your page is already up. Yeah, so here's what's going on. So this is where it actually gets put onto the well, not the scope. They don't call it the scope. It has some other name for where this lands. It becomes available for binding, I guess is the better way to say it. Questions? Comments? Is anybody going to run off and learn Aurelia this week? Paul, you have a question, I can tell.
Right now I'm playing with the idea of writing Aurelia components that can be consumed by Angular 2, because Aurelia components are so thin and lightweight and there's nothing to them, that you should be able to very easily slurp them up into Angular 2.
So there's an interesting idea floating out there, and that is that for the purposes of interop, maybe we should just stop writing for one framework, right? Because right now, if you want something for Angular 1, you got to go find an Angular thing that does what you want, right? Well, Aurelia, to like an extremely high extent, like they're pushing it as far as they can, and Angular 2 pressing it maybe not quite as far, but still pretty far. They're trying to make things that match how web components are going to work. So maybe we could get to a point where instead of composing our applications primarily of components built like to the specifications of one framework we're using today, maybe we could mostly comprise our applications of things that meet a web component spec and then just freely intermix them. That would be fantastic if I didn't have to go find an Angular blah blah when I wanted to do blah blah. More questions and comments? Okay, well, the last thing I had was, I think, a reminder here. We're doing an early start with Angular 2 class. The first one is already full. We have a second one that's not full. Pass the word on. Anybody who wants to come here in St. Louis. We have another one coming up in San Francisco, but I doubt anybody in St. Louis wants to go to that one. But anybody in St. Louis, pass the word that this thing's coming up. Okay, well, thank you for coming. We'll wrap up, and I got to eat some pizza. So.